The marble halls of the Supreme Court had witnessed centuries of history. Landmark rulings, quiet revolutions, the slow grinding gears of American justice. But nothing could have prepared those ancient walls for what was about to unfold on this particular night. The air inside the chamber was different, thicker, electric, as if the building itself knew something momentous was coming. Before we move on, tell us where are you watching from, also subscribe. The overhead lights cast long cathedral shadows across the carved mahogany benches, and the low hum of the ventilation system felt, somehow, like a held breath. Representative Jasmine Crockett walked in like she owned every inch of that floor. She didn't strut. She didn't perform. She simply moved, each step deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of 10,000 constituents who would never set foot in a room like this. Her heels struck the marble in a steady rhythm that seemed to say, "I belong here. I have always belonged here." The gallery was packed. Journalists with press badges pressed against the wooden rails. Legal scholars leaned forward in their seats, notebooks open, pens poised. Ordinary citizens, somehow granted entry on this extraordinary evening, sat wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of what they were witnessing even before it began. At the center of it all, elevated behind the bench like a figure carved from the mountain of the law itself, sat Chief Justice John Roberts, silver-haired, composed, his eyes sharp and assessing, the kind of eyes that had read 10,000 briefs and reduced 10,000 arguments to dust. He watched Crockett enter. She felt his gaze. She did not flinch. The case itself, on paper, was a dispute tangled in ethics, in procedural violations, in the kind of fictional legal labyrinth that Washington seemed to conjure with alarming regularity. But everyone in that room understood something the court documents couldn't capture. This wasn't really about the case. This was about two immovable forces, two entirely different visions of what justice meant, colliding at the speed of history. Roberts called the session to order with a single strike of his gavel. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Silence fell instantly. Total. Complete. Miss Crockett. His voice was measured, authoritative, the kind of voice designed to fill rooms and end conversations. You are a politician, not a lawyer. The marble halls of the Supreme Court had witnessed centuries of history, landmark rulings, quiet revolutions, the slow and grinding gears of American justice turning through generations of triumph and tragedy. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared those ancient walls for what was about to unfold on this particular night. Before we move on, subscribe us. The air inside the chamber was different, thicker, charged with something invisible but undeniable, the way the atmosphere changes in the moments before a storm breaks open the sky. The overhead lights cast long cathedral shadows across the carved mahogany benches, and the low hum of the ventilation system felt, somehow, like a building holding its breath, waiting, anticipating, bracing for impact. Representative Jasmine Crockett walked in like she owned every inch of that floor. She didn't strut. She didn't perform. She simply moved, each step deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of 10,000 constituents who would never set foot in a room like this. Her heels struck the marble in a steady, measured rhythm that said everything without saying a word. I belong here. I have always belonged here. And tonight, I intend to prove it. The gallery was packed to its limits. Journalists with laminated press badges pressed tight against the wooden rails, their eyes already scanning for the moment that would define tomorrow's headlines. Legal scholars leaned forward in their seats, notebooks cracked open, pens trembling with readiness. Ordinary citizens, somehow granted entry on this extraordinary evening, sat wide-eyed and breathless, sensing the gravity of what they were witnessing even before the first word had been spoken. At the center of it all, elevated behind the great bench like a figure carved from the very mountain of the law, sat Chief Justice John Roberts, silver-haired, immaculate, composed with the kind of stillness that only comes from decades of absolute authority. His eyes were sharp and deeply assessing, the eyes of a man who had read 10,000 briefs, dismantled 10,000 arguments, and reduced some of the sharpest legal minds in the country to stammering silence. He watched Crockett enter the chamber. She felt his gaze land on her like a hand pressed to her shoulder. She did not flinch, she did not slow. She simply looked back at him with a steadiness that made several members of the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. The case itself was, on paper, a dispute tangled in ethics violations, procedural infractions, and the kind of murky legal labyrinth that Washington seemed to conjure with alarming frequency. But everyone seated in that room understood something the court documents could never capture. This was not really about the case. This was about two immovable forces, two entirely different visions of what justice means and who it serves, colliding head-on at the crossroads of power and principle. Roberts called the session to order with a single strike of his gavel. The sound rang through the chamber like a gunshot. Silence fell instantly, completely, with an almost physical weight that pressed down on every person present. Ms. Crockett. His voice was measured and deliberate, the kind of voice built to fill rooms and end arguments before they begin. You are a politician, not a lawyer, so I must ask, what exactly do you believe you are doing in my courtroom? The question landed hard. It was designed to land hard. Several members of the gallery inhaled sharply. A few journalists began scribbling immediately. Legal scholars exchanged weighted glances. Because Roberts wasn't merely asking a procedural question. He was issuing a warning. He was drawing a line in the marble and daring her to cross it. He was telling her, in the polished language of judicial authority, that she did not belong here, that she was out of her depth, that the mechanisms of this court were beyond her reach. Crockett let the silence breathe for exactly 1 beat longer than was comfortable. Then she raised her chin and said, with a quiet ferocity that seemed to warm the very air between them, I'm both, Chief Justice. I am a politician and I am a fighter for justice. And tonight I am here because the people I serve have no one else to speak for them in rooms like this one. The gallery exhaled. Some shifted toward her. Others tensed, uncertain. Court officers along the walls straightened, hands moving instinctively to their sides, their training telling them that something was happening here that exceeded the ordinary boundaries of a hearing. Roberts did not blink. He consulted his notes with the deliberate patience of a man entirely unbothered, then looked up again and delivered his ruling in the flat, unyielding tone of someone reading from stone tablets. He cited a violation in Crockett's legal argument, a procedural overreach tied to the ethics dispute at the heart of the case, and with the calm authority of a man accustomed to having the final word, he imposed a fine of $200,000 for contempt of court. The number hit the room like a detonation. $200,000. The gallery erupted in a wave of gasps, murmurs, disbelieving whispers. Several people reached for their phones instinctively, thumbs already moving, already broadcasting the moment to a world that was about to become very, very interested. Crockett did not gasp. She did not pale. Her eyes flashed, a brief, brilliant fire. And then she steadied herself and said, in a voice that cut through the noise of the gallery like a blade through silk, "Reckless? Chief Justice, I have spent my entire career fighting for truth in rooms where truth was unwelcome. You will not silence that fight with a dollar amount." The words fell into the chamber and seemed to echo off every surface, bouncing back amplified. Some members of the gallery nodded openly. Others pressed their lips together in discomfort. The court officers looked at one another. This proceeding, everyone now understood, was veering into territory that none of them had mapped. Roberts's expression remained composed, but something behind his eyes shifted. A tightening, an almost imperceptible recalibration. He had presided over contentious hearings before. He had faced sharp advocates and fierce arguments. But there was something different about the way this woman stood in his courtroom. something that refused to be categorized, filed away, and dismissed. He pressed forward, his tone hardening. "Ms. Crockett, you are here representing a legal argument, not delivering a campaign speech. Your passion, however genuine it may be, does not override the rules of this court. The fine stands." He struck the gavel again. Final, absolute. Or so he believed. Crockett leaned forward slightly, just a few inches, and spoke with a precision that was almost surgical. "You don't understand my fight, Chief Justice. And I don't say that with disrespect. I say it because I've watched the system you're sworn to uphold fail the people I represent, over and over again, in ways that never make it to a courtroom like this one. They don't get marble halls. They don't get mahogany benches. They get outcomes, cold, impersonal, crushing outcomes, and they get silence. I am here tonight to end that silence." The gallery seemed to stop breathing. Even the journalists had paused their scribbling. Even the legal scholars had set down their pens. Something was happening in this room that transcended the legal dispute at its center, something raw and real and uncomfortably human. Roberts struck back with characteristic precision. "People, Ms. Crockett, you claim to be here for the people. But what I see before me is chaos dressed in conviction, defiance dressed as principle. This court demands order, and your presence here tonight is a disruption to that order." His words were cold, clinical, chosen for maximum effect. But something in the delivery, something almost imperceptible, had shifted. The authority was still there. The firmness was still there. But underneath it, faint as a hairline fracture in a wall of granite, there was something else beginning to show through. Crockett straightened to her full height. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, lower, more grounded, more real. "I carry the people's pain, Chief Justice. That is not a metaphor. I carry it in my chest every single day. I carry it when I sit across from mothers who've lost sons to systems that were never designed to protect them. I carry it when I speak to workers who've been crushed beneath the weight of policies that were written in rooms exactly like this one, by people who will never know what it costs to live with those policies. That is what I carry into your courtroom tonight, and you can fine me $200,000. You can fine me $200 million, but you cannot fine away what these people have suffered." The silence that followed was unlike any silence the chamber had produced before. It wasn't the silence of deference or protocol. It was the silence of impact. The silence that falls when something true has been said aloud in a place that is not accustomed to truth arriving in this form. Several members of the gallery were visibly moved. A woman in the third row pressed her hand to her mouth. A journalist in the press box stared at his blank notepad as if he had forgotten what he was supposed to be doing. Even the court officers, trained to project neutrality, stood with expressions they could not entirely control. Roberts gripped the edge of the bench. "Miss Crockett, you are out of line." But his voice, that famous authoritative chamber-filling voice, was half a measure quieter than it had been. Just half a measure. But everyone noticed. The gallery noticed. The journalists noticed. Crockett noticed. And she pressed forward with the instinct of someone who has been in enough fights to know when the tide has begun to turn. She spoke about a family from her district, a mother, 2 children, a landlord who had used every legal mechanism available to him to remove them from their home in winter. She spoke about the son, 17 years old, who had stood on a sidewalk in January with everything he owned in a garbage bag, watching his mother cry in the cold, and who had asked Crockett, when she visited the community center where they were staying, why the law seemed to know how to hurt people but never how to help them. She spoke slowly, clearly, without theatrics, without performance. She simply told the truth, and the truth was devastating. Roberts's jaw tightened. His hand moved slightly on the bench. And then, in a moment that no legal textbook had prepared anyone in that room to witness, his eyes glistened. It was brief, a shimmer, but it was real, and it was seen, and it was everything. "Families," he said. and his voice carried the sound of a man doing battle with something inside himself. "You are a politician, Miss Crockett. It is not your place to—" He stopped, started again. "This court has procedures for a reason." But the words landed differently now. They landed like a defense rather than a declaration. Crockett's voice, when she responded, was the gentlest it had been all night. And somehow, that gentleness was more powerful than all the fire that had come before it. "Chief Justice, I know you believe in this court. I know you believe in the law. So do I. But the law is not always where justice lives. And the people I represent, the families, the workers, the children standing on sidewalks in January with everything they own in a bag, they need someone in this room who knows the difference. Tonight, I am that person. And I am not afraid of your fine. I am not afraid of your gavel. I am here, and I will keep being here, because that boy in January deserves a world where the law and justice are the same thing. And until they are, I will not be silent." The chamber erupted. There was no other word for it. Several gallery members were on their feet. Some were weeping openly, without embarrassment, without apology. Journalists abandoned their professional composure entirely. Their faces cracked open with something that looked very much like awe. Court officers stood frozen at their posts, their training entirely insufficient for this particular moment. Their hands still and their eyes wide. The live record captured everything: the sound, the motion, the unmistakable sense of history bending slightly on its axis. And at the center of it all, behind the great bench, Chief Justice John Roberts sat with his head slightly bowed and his eyes wet. Not a performance, not a strategic display of empathy. Something authentic and involuntary that had broken through the decades of judicial composure like water through old stone. He was silent for a long moment, long enough that the gallery began to settle, long enough that the room pulled itself back from the edge of pure chaos. And then he spoke quietly, in a voice that the chamber had to strain to hear. "Your point," he said, "is made." 4 words, that was all. But they landed with the weight of a verdict. The gallery surged again. A wave of sound, of cheering, of sobbing, of people reaching for one another in the stunned recognition that they had all just witnessed something they would spend the rest of their lives describing to people who would never quite believe them. Crockett stood still in the center of it all, her composure intact, her eyes bright, her hands clasped around her notes. She did not pump her fist. She did not smile with triumph. She simply stood there, absorbing the moment, letting it belong to every person she had named and every person she hadn't. Afterwards, in the corridor outside the chamber, surrounded by her team and a swarm of reporters, Crockett paused just long enough to speak 3 words into the noise. "I spoke for them," she said, quietly, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once, before her aides guided her forward and the doors closed behind her. Within hours, the internet had done what the internet does with moments like this one. Clips circulated, threads multiplied, hashtags bloomed and spread across every platform. Millions of people who had never stepped inside a courtroom, who would never argue before the Supreme Court, who would never stand the way Crockett stood and speak, the way Crockett spoke. They watched the footage on their phones in bed, on their lunch breaks, on their commutes, and they felt something that is very difficult to name, but very easy to recognize. They felt seen. They felt heard. They felt, for a brief and blazing moment, like the law and justice might one day be the same thing after all. And in a chamber that had grown quiet again, where the lights still cast their long cathedral shadows and the gavel rested in its place on the bench, the marble walls held everything. The echoes of every argument ever made in that room, every ruling, every moment of clarity and every moment of failure. And now this, the night a congresswoman from Texas walked into the highest court in the land, refused to be silenced, and left the Chief Justice of the United States in tears. If you like this video, then subscribe.